Good morning and good day, colleagues and friends. Welcome to this virtual launch of our report titled Expanding Needs, Diminishing Means. As I was saying, welcome friends and colleagues to this virtual launch of our report titled Expanding Needs, Diminishing Means, a mapping of trends in funding for HIV-related social enablers in Southern and East Africa, which is hosted by the AIDS and Rights Alliance for Southern Africa, also known as ARASA, with support from the Robert Carr Fund. My name is Felicita Hikwam, and I'm the director of the AIDS and Alliance for Southern Africa. Once again, I have the honor of welcoming you to this very exciting webinar and moderating the discussion. This is the last of ARASA's webinars for the year, which brings a great sense of excitement to myself, and I'm sure for the rest of the team. It's been quite a year. Before we get started, I have a few announcements to assist with your participation in this webinar. Firstly, the webinar will only be conducted in English and there is no interpretation available. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded on the ARASA website, our YouTube channel, and other social media platforms. This webinar is also now being live streamed on the ARASA Facebook page, and you can feel free to share it from there on your social media. While this webinar is a safe and neutral space for sharing of experiences and perspectives in a mutually respectful manner, we encourage you to be mindful of revealing your personal particulars if you are not comfortable for this to be public. ARASA has a zero tolerance policy for undesirable behaviors, including bullying, harassment, abusive use of language, and aggressive expressions of opinions. Anyone who engages in such actions will be immediately removed from the session with no prior notice. In the interest of time, we will not make use of the raise hand function or allow participants to speak during this webinar, but we strongly encourage you to share your comments, thoughts, and reflections and questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box or in the Facebook comment section. Throughout this webinar, we will engage you using various online platforms. One of these is the Mentimeter platform. And in order for us to do this, please open a new window in your web browser when we get to that part of the agenda, and then go to www.menti.com, www.menti.com. So www.menti.com. We will then provide you with a code for the Menti survey, as I mentioned, when we get to that part of the agenda. Now, with those announcements out of the way, I want to wish you a happy International Human Rights Day. Today, we commemorate the day in 1948 when the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This year's theme is Recover Better, Stand Up for Human Rights, which is related to the COVID-19 pandemic and focuses on the need to build back better by ensuring that human rights are central to recovery efforts. The theme recognizes that we will only reach our common global development goals if we are able to create equal opportunities for all, address the failures exposed and exploited by COVID-19, and apply human rights standards to tackle entrenched, systemic, and intergenerational inequalities, exclusion, and discrimination. Not only has COVID-19 exacerbated existing fault lines in our healthcare system, it has also exposed underlying vulnerabilities facing various sectors of our society, including community systems and the NGO sector. Which brings us to this webinar, which has been a long time coming. In 2018, ARASA conducted a partner audit with its 100 partners. This audit surfaced that a significant number of partners had experienced a decrease in funding for their human rights and social enablers work in the region. In response to this, we commissioned Equal International with their amazing lead researcher, Maria Stacy, who conducted this research study for us, or who led the work to conduct this research study in 2019 with, of course, back support from the Robert Carr Fund, as I mentioned previously. Just as we were about to launch this report, COVID-19 hit, and soon it became clear that the pandemic was affecting funding for social enablers work. We halted the launch of the report and undertook a second phase of our research to explore how COVID-19 was impacting on funding for social enablers, including human rights programming. The value of community-led HIV responses and social enablers was recognized way back in 2016 in the Political Declaration on Ending AIDS, which commits United Nations member states to ensuring that national AIDS strategies empower people living with and at risk of and affected by HIV to know their rights and to access justice and legal services to prevent and challenge violations of human rights, and that at least 6% of all global AIDS resources go towards social enablers, including advocacy, community and political mobilization, community monitoring, outreach programs, and public communication by 2020. And while the global HIV sector grapples with how to quantify these investments, the UNAIDS 2020 Global AIDS Update recently reminded us that we are far from meeting this target, as key enablers of effective HIV responses remain neglected in dozens of regions or dozens of countries across multiple regions. This has resulted in 3.5 million more HIV infections and 820,000 more AIDS-related deaths than if the world was on track to meet the target by 2020. Over the next hour and a half, we will learn about the findings of the research, as well as recommendations emanating from these findings. This will be followed by a panel discussion deliberating on the findings of the panel, of the research by a panel of activists who support social enablers globally and in Botswana, Malawi, and Uganda. They will reflect on the key findings of the research and also share their experiences and perspectives on the impact of recent funding trends on their work around social enablers. Again, a reminder that we will not use the raise hands function or allow participants to speak during the session, but we really strongly encourage you to please share your thoughts and questions in the chat box, the Q&A box, and the comment section of the Facebook live stream. To kick us off and to ground us in the themes we will be discussing today, we would like to hear a little bit from you around what is happening in your context related to funding for HIV-related social enablers. In order to do this, as I mentioned previously, we will use the Mentimeter platform. So if you could please open a new window in your web browser and type in www.menti.com. The code for our survey is 8608270. So again, it's www.menti.com and the code is 8608270. We will also paste this in the chat just to make it a bit easier for people to be able to find their way to this Menti questionnaire. We really do want to know about your experiences, what is happening in your context, and just your general sense of funding for social enablers in your context, but also maybe what you've heard of from partner organizations and others that are working on these issues. It always really helps ground us when we know the kind of perspectives that you bring to the discussion. So I see there's one brave soul, much appreciated, two brave souls. Thank you so much, who have added a few words. So we have underappreciated, deprioritized, funder-driven, unflexible, squeezed, limited, inadequate, challenging, restricted, and precarious, changing as well. I think, I mean, my reading of all these words is that it actually speaks to a very challenged environment and a very challenged situation around funding for social enablers. Now, the way that, as most of you know by now, I'm sure, the way that these Mentimeter word clouds work is that the words that are the biggest are the ones that are mentioned most frequently, and the ones that are smaller are, you know, least frequently mentioned. And the one that as you can see, is the biggest is underappreciated. So that must have been mentioned by more than one person. Funded driven is a really interesting one that I think we should unpack a little bit later in the session. Squeezed, unflexible, that's very interesting. Deprioritized, funding for social enablers is non-inclusive, it's limited, it's changing, it's challenging, restricted, funded driven. Now it seems as though all the words are of equal size, and we've had 5 responses. Thank you so much to everyone. All the words are of equal size, so they've all been mentioned about the same frequency or the same amount of times. I'm just sitting back because, you know, I just want to make sure that I'm not underrepresenting or misrepresenting your responses. But from where I'm sitting, it seems like all of these words are about the same size. We have, I think, 1 new response. Squeezed, changing, unflexible, non-inclusive, challenging, precarious, not appreciated, underappreciated. I'm sure that the under and not appreciated would have been a little bit of a bigger size because it's mentioned twice if those exact same words were replicated. But they really speak to the same thing, that funding for social enablers is underappreciated, it's very funded driven, it's not prioritized, it's inadequate, it's precarious, challenging, non-inclusive, unflexible, restricted, squeezed, and changing. And from my read, I mean, all of these words are quite negative. I mean, they're not positive, kind of optimistic, you know, positive words in the sense that it is a good situation that we find ourselves in when we think about social enablers. Yeah, just to kind of go through these words again as we close this question: under-resourced, funded-driven, challenging, restricted, inadequate, unflexible, precarious, not appreciated, underappreciated, not prioritized, changing, limited, non-inclusive, deprioritized, and squeezed. So that's what comes to mind when we think about the current situation related to HIV-related social enablers. Next question, please. And again, just a reminder that you can join this survey by going to www.menti.com and using the code 8608270. We have 1 more question coming up, and that gives you a little bit of time to, you know, open this window on your web browser. The second question we have for you is, what is the biggest funding related challenge in implementing HIV-related social enablers such as advocacy, community work, etc.? So by now we know that, you know, it's not a very good situation that we find ourselves in when it comes to funding for social enablers. The environment is restricted, it's limited, it's deprioritized, precarious, etc. But what is the biggest funding related challenge from your perspective when it comes to social enablers? So based on your experience, what is the biggest challenge when it comes to all those restrictions that we've seen in our, you know, in the situation around funding for social enablers? So maybe this is a little bit of a loaded question, but it's also one of those that requires typing of more than 1 word, which takes a little bit of time. But we have responses that say, one of the biggest challenges is actually getting funding to the front line where it is required the most. The next response says, focus on reaching targets in a behavioral and biomedical approach is not sustainable. Human rights fall to the side because of the focus on numbers. And this is really one that I've heard before as well, that one of the challenges is that it's so difficult to generate the kinds of data that behavioral and biomedical interventions generate when we think about social enablers. It's longer term work that is not easily kind of quantifiable, and yeah, you can't, you know, you can't get results in a very short amount of time. There's also restricted funding that's top down, a direction of advocacy and not coming from the communities itself. So the top down nature of advocacy is also a challenge to social enablers work. Funders are wanting large outcomes in unrealistic short timelines, oh, this definitely resonates. All of them resonate, but I think the pressure to show quick results is one that, you know, many of us experience. Over dependence on foreign donors, lack of domestic commitment, that is true too. And then sustainability of this funding, it's often short-term types of support that we find. There's also lack of funding for enablers to carry their work. So lack of funding for the people on the front line to really carry out this work. Thank you so much to the 7 respondents that we've had. Very, very interesting responses. Overdependence on foreign donors, lack of domestic investment, getting funding to the front line, to the enablers that carry out this work, sustainability of the funding because of the short, unrealistic timelines, etc. Thank you so much for those responses. Very interesting. And also, you know, there's quite synergy between some of those responses. How can we improve funding for social enablers? So what are some of the opportunities that are out there that you may have on your radar for us to improve the funding situation for social enablers? It would be great to have your thoughts in terms of, you know, what you've identified as opportunities for social enablers in your context, globally, nationally, regionally, and also specifically for your communities. So the first brave person says, using consortiums or consortia is one of the opportunities. I agree. And the mapping that we did, and we had a webinar last week to share the mapping on the impact of COVID-19 on community-led responses. And a lot of the respondents actually said, having worked in, you know, before COVID in consortia and in partnerships was one of the key reasons why they were able to adapt really quickly during the COVID time. So consortia are really, really important, and working in sister networks really important. Donor commitments and coordination is what we need to improve funding for social enablers. Also agree, stronger collaboration with organizations in the global north, where we unpack the power dynamics. That is really true. And I think it's also a conversation that's happening in different spaces around, you know, the inclusion of Southern voices more and more in these global north conversations. Someone says we need to take work outside of the development bubble. How can we integrate our work into wider society? That is true, and really, you know, resonates because of the whole kind of to take HIV out of the silos, conversation, this sustainable development goals, and the broad kind of approach to development. We need to unite partnerships, opening up partnerships to new members. We need to grow consortia and networks. We need to build an international fund for national work, specifically for national work. We need to link the social enabler outcomes to other development issues. That also links specifically to the one above. Very interesting responses, much appreciated. I think we can now conclude our Menti check-in. It's really, I mean, I really enjoyed this part of the webinars, just to get to know whether some of what we're experiencing also resonates with other people. So very interesting to hear your thoughts and to kind of see what you're bringing into the conversations and into this discussion today. Thank you very much for sharing so generously. Now on to the order of the day and the main kind of business of the day, which is really to hear what the research found and to get to know a little bit more about what has surfaced from this research. I would like to now welcome Maria Stacy, who will present the findings of the research. And while Maria gets ready to share screen and go live with her video, just want to remind you again that we will take a few clarifying questions at the end of her presentation, but only from the Q&A box and the Facebook comment section. So please make sure that you drop your thoughts, reflections, and questions as we go through the presentation. You drop them in the chat boxes and in the comments sections. Thank you, Maria. Please take it away.
This is the part where I always get challenged technologically. Hello, everybody. I just wanted to show my face, as you can see who I am, and greet you all before we start with the presentation. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today and to see so many familiar names in the list of participants and fellow panelists. I also want to welcome my partner in Equal International and also in the study, Anton Ofield-Kerr. Anton, I don't know if you want to just show yourself quickly as well. Anton's based in the UK. I'm based in South Africa. Are you there, Anton? Okay, maybe not. All right, and yeah, just to say it's a pleasure to see you all, and I hope, please God, in 2021 we can be doing this in person, because webinars are great, but there's no substitute for being in a room together, debating, chatting, arguing with each other. So hopefully we'll be able to get together soon. Okay. So as Felicitas says, this study actually goes back a long way. We started with it towards the end of last year. And as she said, just as we were getting ready to launch, COVID hit. And we needed to update the study. Just an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. I'll provide some background, go over the aims and objectives of the study, very briefly the methodology, and then a focus on the findings and recommendations for donors and civil society. It's not going to be really long. It's going to be about 15 minutes because I think it's really important to hear what the panelists have to say about this topic. And I also want to say that I'm very encouraged by a lot of the points that have come up on the Mentimeter so far, because they really echo the findings of this study. So as Felicitas said, our story really starts with a high-level meeting on ending AIDS, which took place in New York in 2016, where our leaders committed to investing at least 6% of all global AIDS resources for social enablers, and ensuring that at least 30% of all service delivery by 2030 is community-led. Oh, and by the way, that 6% of global AIDS resources for social enablers was supposed to be met by 2020. And you'll hear just now why it's completely off track. The other commitment was committing to national AIDS strategies that empower people living with, at risk of, and affected by HIV to know their rights, to access justice and legal services, and to prevent and challenge violations of human rights. Now, Felicita always shows this slide, so I'm taking a leaf from her book, because I think it shows very graphically why social enablers and human rights actually matter. And this slide is taken from the 2012 Global HIV and the Law report. And it shows, and you can see it kind of starts with 2010, and it shows the impact on new HIV infections if we continue with business as usual and with the current legal and policy environment. And on the other hand, the blue line shows how much new HIV infections can be reduced with interventions for enhanced legal and policy environments. And a lot of our work around social enablers and human rights is aimed at those structural barriers and enhancing legal and policy environments. So straight after these commitments were made in 2016, UNAIDS found itself with a problem. And the problem was that even though these are very noble commitments, nobody actually knows what they mean, or there was rather no agreement between donors, governments, UN partners as to exactly what a community-led response is and what a social enabler is. So UNAIDS put together a task team with membership from our region, quite a lot of membership from our region. Kelyn was involved, and Michaela Clayton, the former director of ARASA, I think she led the working group. And they sat and they came up with these definitions. So these, just so that we can have a common understanding going forward of what actually these things mean. So community-led responses are actions and strategies that seek to improve the health and human rights of constituencies that are specifically informed and implemented by and for communities themselves and the organizations that represent them. Community-led responses include advocacy, campaigning and holding decision makers to account, monitoring of policies, practices and service delivery, participatory research, education and information sharing, capacity building, and funding of community-led organizations, groups, and networks. Okay? Social enablers, on the other hand, are strategies, activities, and approaches which create environments that promote accessibility, acceptability, uptake, equitable coverage, quality, effectiveness, and efficiency of HIV interventions and services. And then specific social enablers, which the group came up with, I'm not going to read them in the interest of time, but you can see them there. They came up with a list of social enablers, and those are supported by cross-cutting issues like community system strengthening, political will and investment, and human rights. Just finally, to show you basically the impact of some of that work in the Social Enabler Working Group, probably most of you may have seen this, but if you haven't, I've just included it. Is that on World AIDS Day, UNAIDS released a new report and has actually set some new targets for 2025. Now, these don't replace the 2030 targets, but they just kind of drill down and help us to focus on how we're going to reach those 2030 targets. And as you can see, there's one of the key pillars is now a focus on social enablers, including what's called the new 10-10-10 targets. So less than 10% of countries should have punitive legal and policy environments by 2025. Less than 10% of people living with HIV and key populations should experience stigma and discrimination. And less than 10% of women, girls, people living with HIV and key populations should experience gender equality and violence. So we now have new focused interim targets for 2025. So back to the study, what did we aim to do? Well, we aim to document and assess the current funding environment for community-led responses to HIV in East and Southern Africa, and specifically focus on how the funding environment affects civil society's ability to implement programming to address social enablers. The specific objectives were to map out and assess the impact of a changing donor climate, identify barriers to accessing funding, and then later on, in mid-year, we added an additional objective of assessing the impact of COVID-19 on funding for community-led responses, and then overall to make recommendations on how the barriers that we've identified can be addressed. Our methodology was a desk review, an online survey with ARASA partners, and key informant interviews with civil society organizations, community-based organizations and donors. And I'm happy to see that some of the key informants are with us today. And then, as I said, we updated the report with a rapid assessment of the impact of COVID-19, which was a desk review. Okay, so what did we find? We actually found that disaggregated data on social enablers, human rights, and community responses is very, very scarce. And that's linked to the problems with definitions that I've just mentioned. But overall, when we look at HIV funding, the first slide shows resource availability and key funding sources for HIV in low and middle income countries between 2000 and 2019. Now, the red dot in the top right corner is the estimated resource need. So as you can see, overall, in low and middle income countries, the resources really do not meet the need. If you look a bit closer at this slide, you'll see that the orange is domestic, the green is US government funding, the pinky color is Global Fund, and the other is other international donors. So yeah, not anywhere near where it needs to be. However, interestingly enough, when you look at overall resource availability in East and Southern Africa, you see that the picture looks a bit different. Now, you see in the top right corner, that green dot is the estimated resource needs. And actually in 2017, the resources available exceeded the resource needs. But in the last 2 years, they've come down significantly. So, I mean, we can ask ourselves, it's, you know, maybe a question for another day, is why, if in 2017 we had more money than we actually needed, why is service delivery nowhere near where it needs to be? I think one of the answers to that question is when we look at the slide, that a lot of these resources are going for treatment, right? And much less for prevention, and even less for social enablers and human rights. So in the survey, we asked ARASA partner organizations, how has funding for your organization changed over the past 3 to 5 years? And as you can see, the most common response was that funding has decreased. So almost half said that funding has decreased. A third said that funding has increased, and about 20% said that it was stable. And here are some quotes from some of the participants. This is from a civil society organization. There was a point when there was an increase, but in the last 2 years, things are now extremely challenging. And a donor said, landscape has changed dramatically and it's not shifting for the better. There is shrinking funding. When you look at the big donor organizations, they themselves are going through their own changes in strategies, engaging in transitions and phasing out of countries. How am I doing for time? Are we all right?
Yes,
okay.
You're doing well, thanks.
Okay, cool. So these were the barriers which key informants, both civil society and donors, identified. We hear a lot about the shrinking civil society space, politically and socially. In many countries in our region, there are many barriers to organizations, especially key population organizations, registering and operating. There are specific donor policies which are barriers, and the two topmost of mind are the global gag rule, which restricts abortion funding, even though hopefully with the election of Joe Biden, he has said he's going to rescind the policy as one of his first acts when he becomes president in January. And the other one, of course, is the anti-prostitution loyalty oath, which makes every organization which receives funding to work with sex workers say that they oppose the legalization of prostitution, and which conflates prostitution or sex work with human trafficking. There are rapid changes in donor priorities. This has already been mentioned in the Mentimeter, and often a mismatch with what organizations, based on their own assessment, their own situational assessment, identify as being a priority. There's been a decrease in core funding, and this is a notable trend over the last 10 years, and a shift of funding of program activities. So this person said, donors are happy to throw, sorry, let me just reduce that. Donors are happy to throw program funds, but who do they think is going to do the work? So there's a lack of funding, a dire lack of funding for human resources, especially things like monitoring and evaluation, financial management, overall management, and administration. There's a lot of short-term funding, and I think that if Victor doesn't mind, that this quote was from him, our greatest challenge is that when we have a donor, it's projects of just 1 year. You're doing good work and it comes to an end. You're just getting started and then you have to start winding down. People build expectations. They still come to your offices, but you can't offer them services. You have vibrant staff, but when the project ends, there's a brain drain and you lose them. There's also clearly issues of capacity. And donors see the funding of community-based organizations as being too risky. And this has led to a practice. Now, what I haven't mentioned is that probably all of you know that PEPFAR has committed to transitioning to 70% Indigenous implementation by Indigenous organizations by 2020. But what we're seeing now is that international NGOs are registering in Southern Africa, pretending to be African NGOs, and then using their resources, their expertise to bid on global contracts and squeeze out local organizations. And then a really important point is that human rights interventions need to be programmed differently to service delivery. It's human rights work, advocacy work, work on social enablers is complex, it's responsive. Funding needs to be flexible and nimble. And the same targets which work, and the same monitoring and evaluation frameworks which work for service delivery don't necessarily work for human rights interventions. We asked key informants about their experiences with the two major donors, the US government and the Global Fund. And actually a lot of ARASA's partners do not receive funding from the US government or PEPFAR. There's a perception that they're intimidating, they're difficult to navigate, and that they prefer to focus on biomedical interventions. But there are some positive signs. So I've mentioned the target shifting towards Indigenous funding. We've seen the emergence of people's COPs, which are, for those who don't know, the COP is the country operational plan, which PEPFAR develops every year for every country. And people have started holding, civil society organizations have started holding alternative civil society COPs. And PEPFAR has actually been quite responsive. And one of perhaps the positive outcomes is that PEPFAR is increasingly investing in community-led monitoring. Global Fund is seen as being an ally because the Global Fund makes major investments in human rights, but the experience of organizations differs from country to country. So you can have very progressive policies and strategies at Geneva level, but in country, if your country coordinating mechanism or your principal recipient doesn't get it, it can be a big barrier to how you experience the Global Fund. And of course, Global Fund, anybody who's ever been involved with implementing a Global Fund grant knows that they are very administratively demanding. Okay, so with waning donor funding, what can civil society do? What are alternative means of mobilizing resources? In this study, almost all the organizations received all or most of their funding from foreign donors and very few from their own domestic governments. They know they need to prepare for transition, but how? What are the alternatives? So a lot of these alternatives were kind of abstract in the sense that organizations weren't really, they knew about these kind of alternative mechanisms, but they weren't really implementing them or using them to raise funds in any sort of substantial way. So the first one is social contracting, which is whereby domestic governments enter into partnerships with community organizations to implement their programs. And then there's alternative financing mechanisms, indirect state support, leveraging your internal resources like selling goods or subletting your offices, private sector partnerships, and interacting with society like crowdfunding, direct donations, etc. The problem is that because a lot of the work we do is quite complex and it's also not really popular, like the work with key populations, for example, it's not really something that the private sector is really going to buy. And one key informant said, corporates like funding teddy bears for sick kids, and our causes are not popular causes. And one donor said, you know, people are aware that the funding environment is changing. There's increased use of technology. There's increased use of business models, like return of investment on social justice work. But she said, how do you measure these things? I don't know if civil society should ignore it or play the game. Impact of COVID-19. As Felicita mentioned earlier, and as was said in last week's webinar, civil society organizations and community-based and community-led organizations have been absolutely critical in responding swiftly and responsively and creatively to COVID. And they've harnessed the existing platforms and networks which they've developed during the HIV response. Some donors have instituted rapid response grants. Frontline AIDS was mentioned, AIDS Funds and the Elton John Foundation. But on the whole, larger donors were very, very slow to respond. And so what happened was a lot of the time, the emergency relief work was being done by CBOs unfunded. CBOs are fearful about the future. They experience or they're anticipating a loss of donor funding and a decrease in new grants for HIV. In ARASA study, they found that some of the smaller CBOs are facing eviction and they're facing an inability to retain staff. None of the 25 CSOs which ARASA surveyed had received funds from governments or their national AIDS councils. And there's generally a fear about the future. So we have a global economic crisis and donor governments are becoming more inward looking and less likely to want to fund work in developing countries. So we've come to the recommendations and we divided them into recommendations for donors and recommendations for civil society. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because I'm quite keen to hear about the recommendations from the panelists. So the first point is that social enablers and human rights require flexible funding. As I said earlier, this kind of work is fundamentally different to service delivery work, where you can measure how many HIV tests you did, how many patients are on ARVs, da, da, da. And the templates, the budgets, the monitoring frameworks need to reflect this. They also require a longer term investment. These are the kind of work we do does not bear fruit in the short term. And then there needs to be better donor coordination with each other. So if we are going to reach those targets on social enablers, on human rights, on community responses, donors need to work together and have common indicators. Donors should support consortia, that's already come up from in the Menti meter. They should see beyond the proposal. So you can have, you know, a US-based organization which is registered in Malawi, for example, which can do like a really excellent proposal, but they've never worked on the ground. And donors need to look beyond the quality of the proposal and think about what selection criteria are really important, what skills are most important, and how can they assess those? And they also need to minimize bureaucracy. Because just because you're able to write, you know, a good report doesn't necessarily mean you're good at doing the work. Those are two separate skills. Civil society should work more in partnerships, build coalitions, embrace and the policy priorities. They need to make a case for human rights and social enablers. So we need to invest in helping people to understand why our work is so important and commit to investing in documentation, monitoring, learning and evaluation, research partnerships, and communicating our successes, our impact, our failures, and our lessons learned. We need to look at strengthening the governance of civil society and strengthening our organizational systems. And we need to explore innovative funding. There are opportunities out there. And some of the key informants said it would be a good idea for CSOs and donors to come together and workshop ideas and experiences around innovative funding strategies. And we need to educate our donors. So one person said, stop being passive receivers of money, giving all the power to funders, do more capacity strengthening of them. Continue pushing them. And finally, we need to demand accountability from our governments. So all of our governments in Africa have committed to the Abuja Declaration. They've made many commitments to increasing domestic financing for health. And they should be supporting community-based organizations much more than they are doing now. And that's something that civil society needs to stay tuned into and involved in transition strategies and the development of social contracting mechanisms. And that is it. Thank you very much, everybody.
And thank you, Maria. Thank you so much. The report itself is actually like a 70-page document, but thank you for synthesizing that into such a succinct presentation. Also to mention that we have now made the report and the research brief, which really summarizes the research report into about 10 pages. They are both available on our ARASA website. So we will also share the link for you to be able to download those reports once this webinar is over. I want to give an opportunity for us to take some questions that have come in. We've got one from a question and a comment from Nathaniel. But I wanted to actually also pose a question to you, Maria, which is going to be the first question I will pose to the panelists. And I really am quite interested to know which of the findings, so as the researcher, as the person who actually conducted this research and compiled the report, which of the findings really stood out for you or were unexpected or really surprised you or affirmed, something that you had experienced or actually thought or heard of anecdotally, but it became much clearer through this research. So while you kind of, let that question marinate, which of the findings stood out for you as the researcher or the lead researcher on this piece of work? And while you do that, let's look at the comments from Nathaniel, which says, I find the dropping out of countries by donors a dangerous precedent and based on wealth and not rights. How can we ensure that advocacy for human rights continues in countries where other donors are moving away from? And this speaks specifically to this move of governments transitioning out of countries that are now supposedly classified as, upper middle income countries. And the question really is, how can we ensure that advocacy for human rights continues in those countries? And I think this is also a question that maybe some of the panelists could respond to once we get through my questions. So this is one that we can also pose to some of the panelists as we go through the panel discussion. But Maria, if you could respond to those two questions. So any thoughts you have on how to ensure that advocacy for human rights continues in countries where donors are moving away from, they're transitioning out, and then also which of the findings took you by surprise?
Okay, I'm going to answer your second question there, and I'm going to ask Anton to maybe respond to the question about donor transitions, because that's something that he's really passionate about. I think what stood out for me and what really came out in the key informant interviews is that it's very challenging, it's very precarious, but it's not all bad. We can't uniformly say that it's terrible. And when you speak to individual organizations, it's amazing how innovative and creative some organizations are about what they do with their resources. And they take a very active and assertive approach to mobilizing resources. Because organizations have two choices, right, with the rapidly changing donor priorities. They either change their priorities with the donors, or else they say, this is what we stand for. This is what we're all about. This is our strategy. This is our theory of change. And we're going to look for funding to support that. And that's a big risk. But ultimately, some organizations did that really, really well. And I think the other thing is really that it's like people don't talk about their personal finances. Organizations don't talk about their funding situation and how worrisome it is. And I think that there's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of ideas within the CSO community. And I think we need more opportunities to get together and talk about how difficult it is and what this one has tried, and maybe we should try that too. So, and also think it's really important to have an opportunity to speak with donors. You know, I come from a CBO background, and I used to think of donors as being very, very remote and having so much power. And, you know, they're human beings and they're trying to do good work, but sometimes they need guidance to do so.
Great, thanks for that response. I see that Anton says that he is unable to speak. The system doesn't allow him to. And I've suggested that maybe he types his response. I didn't know that, you know, we couldn't at some point allow people to speak. But I was suggesting that Anton can type his response and one of us can read it out while I read the response from Livy. Maybe Anton, if you could type
Anton, I can make Anton speak.
You can let Anton speak, please do. And I will come in with Livy's response after.
Anton, you should be able to speak now.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much.
So you can control people.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Great presentation, Maria. I think for me, one of the points that really stood out from the research was the level of donor fatigue. So the good donors, the donors that we consider good, that support human rights and social enablers, their level of fatigue of funding civil society, and I think there was their fatigue at the how uncohesive civil society groups and human rights groups are, and particularly what they said was, you know, particularly amongst, say, key population networks. And so what they were encouraging was a sense of fatigue amongst of often the wrangling between different civil society organizations and networks. And what they were calling for was for particularly around key population HIV, human rights work, to actually engage more with the mainstream human rights actors and players. And what they were pointing out was up until now, we've relied on HIV funding in their frameworks, but actually there's other funding available through human rights programs and funds. And they were encouraging almost like the mainstreaming of that HIV work into broader human rights work.
Oh, great. And a response on the transition issue? Anton, can you hear me? Anton?
Anton?
Sorry, say that again?
A response to the question regarding governments transitioning and what can be done to support human rights advocacy, and that advocacy for human rights continues in those countries where governments are transitioning.
So I can't see all the questions, so thanks for reading them out. I think what you're saying is what can be done to support civil society to secure funding. Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, advocacy. So funding for advocacy for human rights in those countries where donors are transitioning. And I mean, my understanding of the question is that a lot of the funding, and we also saw that on the Mentimeter, funding for social enablers and advocacy for human rights is externally funded.
Yeah.
So in those countries where external donors are transitioning out, and funding like the Global Fund funding is transitioning out of several countries, that work still needs to be done. So what are the opportunities and what can we do to ensure that advocacy for human rights and social enablers continues in those countries?
I think the real challenge is, as you've outlined, is that we're very dependent on donor funding for human rights work. And the funding architecture as it stands means that many donors, as you said, transition out of countries, particularly when they identify as middle income country. I think one of the things that can be done is looking into donors' policies and frameworks and the way in which they fund different work. So for example, where donors fund work, say through HIV or sexual reproductive health and rights, and that's a funding stream, particularly say for the Netherlands that we've relied on, there are other parts of donor governments that support democracy, human rights, open societies, which were not used to accessing. Other networks and groups are used to accessing. So I think the immediate kind of mitigation is getting to know the other funding streams for our kind of work, and the work that we care about, which isn't traditional what we've been used to, HIV, sexual reproductive health work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. It totally does. Thank you so much, Anton. And you know, there were some things you said that I wanted to also reflect on, but in the interest of time, I'd like to shift some of this discussion to the panel discussion, and we will take a few more of the comments and questions that have come from the participants when we go through the panel discussion. I just wanted to take the one from Livy, and it's basically a comment that says, "Thank you, Maria, for raising the voice for for community-based organizations. Our work is important because we experience the challenges firsthand. The bureaucracy around funding should stop and resources should be given accordingly, please." Thank you, Livy, for that comment. There are a few others that I will take, as I said, during the panel discussion, but I'm now dying to hear the thoughts of our esteemed panelists, who I'm very, very grateful for having agreed to join us today. I know it's Human Rights Day, and a lot of you, given the work that you do, should be somewhere else and could be somewhere else, but you chose to be here with us at this time, and we really do appreciate it. But I'd like to welcome them individually and ask them to please put on their video cameras. First, I'd like to welcome Medora Muzinguzi, who is the Executive Director of the Uganda Network on Law, Ethics and HIV/AIDS, also known as Uganet. Hey, Dora. You're muted.
Hello, Felista, and how is everyone? Thank you for having me.
We are good. I hope Kampala is treating you well.
We are well, thank you.
Okay. Next, I'd like to welcome Nana Gleason, who is the Finance Operations and Resource Mobilization Manager at the Botswana Network on Ethics, Law and HIV/AIDS, also known as Bonella. Welcome, Nana.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you
Thank
for
you so
being
much.
here. Thank you for being here, and thank you for always raising the bar when it comes to just, you know, being on fleek. I put the red lipstick on just for you. Our next panelist.
Oh my God, thank you.
I hope you appreciate, huh? It could be behind a mask somewhere. Our next panelist is Victor Mango, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights Education, Advice and Assistance in Malawi.
I'm not hearing you.
Hi.
Hi, Victor. Are you going to give us a glimpse of what you look like this morning?
I think I've been muted, something like that. I think my video is off, and it's me saying that the host has done that.
Has done that. Okay.
So the host should actually.
The host is abusing their powers and
yes.
will enable you to share your video.
Actually, I was abusing the powers of the host because I was on the video.
You were on video the whole time.
Yes, yes.
But we will give you back your powers in 1 minute. There you go.
Yes.
It's good to see. It's a sunny, bright morning in Lilongwe, I suppose.
No, Blantyre, but I'm actually in Katabe. We are doing some activities for the International Human Rights Day.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Our last panelist to be introduced this morning is a very dear global activist who has, you know, moved mountains and helped move mountains globally around this work. Please welcome Peter van Rooyen, who is a board member of the Joop Lange Institute and will be sharing some global perspectives with us this morning. Good morning, Peter, or good afternoon, actually.
Morning. For me, it's morning. No, it's morning.
It's morning still. Okay. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us. So without further ado, I would like to get started by posing my first question, which is the same one that I had posed to Maria about which of the findings or even the recommendations of this research were most significant or interesting to you. I'd like to start with Nana, and then I'll go to Dora. And Peter and then Victor, you can, be the tail end of responding to this question. So Nana, do you want to take us away? And also just to say, in the interest of time, I'm going to stick to 3 questions for this round. And then we'll see if anything comes in from the participants, and then we'll continue with some of my questions. But I'll do 3 questions for now and just ask you to be quite brief in your responses. Thanks, Nana.
So thank you, everyone. I found the whole document very interesting. I think with the history that I have with Bonella, where when we started as an organization, our entire program was really around social enablers, and the trajectory that we have made into also doing service delivery while still maintaining our social enabler work was very interesting to see that a lot of people were saying that they're not able to, to sort of expand or innovate in terms of how they program so that they can continue doing human rights work or social enabler work. So when I read that, I thought, oh, hang on, that's something that possibly we should be, sharing with people, to say it is possible to actually expand your programs to do some level of service delivery, if that will give you some additional resources while still maintaining your whole social enabler focus. So that was a quite interesting thing in terms of how do we make sure that communities can innovate so that they can still do their core work or their passion work and then still provide services at a community level. Also, I think the issue of the shrinking donor space, I think it's a really scary situation. And like Maria said, I think we need to basically find platforms where as communities, we can continue to, stake our claim and be able to still do the programs that we want without thinking that, okay, we have to immediately change to a donor agenda. I think it's really, really important to stay true to why we exist and the work that we do. So yeah, it was very interesting to see that that was quite one of the major issues. And then also around the issue of domestic financing, I think it is critically important that there should be some kind of program that we bring into place to really try to advance the issue of domestic financing in countries, and particularly for social enabler work. And I think the whole skew towards social contracting and innovative financing is something that we have to jump on the bandwagon. Botswana as a country, we're already there. We hope that the government of Botswana will start using their social contracting framework in the next Global Fund cycle. That's the aim. That's the work that we've been supporting in country. So we're very excited about seeing it work. Obviously, it's not a panacea to everything, but at least it's a start to make sure that government takes social enabler, human rights, all those kind of programs seriously at a country level. Yeah.
Thanks, Nana. Thanks so much. I want to go into the discussion around social contracting when we talk about opportunities. So okay, maybe great. The other panelists can also, kind of have a think about that in the meantime. Dora, what stood out for you?
Thank you very much, Felista, and greetings, everyone. We're excited reading this report and finding the evidence that it adds to our collection of voices that we've been having. So I would like to start by congratulating ARASA on arming us once more with a tool that we can use to demand for better. What I find fascinating is what we've known, that social enablers are not prioritized. And what our participants just said earlier in the exercise that we did, the report solidifies all that. It's not sustainable, it is not prioritized, it's not a core issue for governments, it's not a core issue for donors, and even the little that has been coming through is reducing every other year. And even the environment where this work is done is shrinking every other time. So I believe that this report gives us a tool, provides an impetus to demand further locally, but also globally. When the challenges are getting more complicated, when the epidemics are increasing, and yet when we see the evidence coming out that social enablers are critical, we shall not move forward without them. This report gives us a point of conversation. Yes, I believe not all is lost, but probably, since this is where we need to be, what better can we be doing? So for me, the core finding around, in particular, capacity, because this is not exactly true for all organizations. The report was clear that there is actually a considerable group of partners that are investing in this work, and there is also a group of partners that are receiving the resources. The question is, for those that need them and don't receive the resources, do we see them? Do we know them? And what do we plan for them? Because these are the core. Probably in our context and rhetoric of human rights, leaving no one behind. A big organization will receive the funding. The big organization will meet PEPFAR requirements and meet Global Fund requirements. A small group of sex worker-led association will not. A key population group will not. A small group of people living with HIV will not. So this report asks us to question what we take as dear. Who are we leaving behind, even in the resource allocation that is available? It is a good indication that about 43% are receiving the resources, but then the 58 are being left behind. We would want to know who those are, and we definitely know that the ones who would, the front line, the grassroots, will probably not receive this money, and that the report explains further the capacity issues. When bigger multinational or international organizations can receive the resources, the example from South Africa, how the local organizations cannot receive resources, it's the same in our country. We have what we call international NGOs are receiving the resources. It's the same case in Kenya. The Global Fund resources of removing legal barriers was received by AMREF. AMREF is like a bigger organization. It is the receiving entity for several other smaller organizations. And when you receive the money for Global Fund as a principal recipient, it means that the bigger support of resources go to you, and the other parties in the consortium receive only a little bit. So when money for human rights go to an international organization, the issues of capacity, the issues of access, the issues of reach become very complicated. So I'm glad that it's a tool we can use to make this voice go further. But it also asks me, even for us who receive the money, where is the power of agency? For whom are we receiving the money? Do they receive it? And who is still being left behind? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dora, for all those questions that you're posing. I mean, and as you said, this report really is a conversation starter. I think the launch of the report and the dissemination report should not and will not be the end of this conversation. It really is the beginning of work that needs to happen using this report as a tool. Peter, do you want to share some of your reflections on what stood out for you?
Yeah, and so this is a dinosaur speaking, right? Looking at the other participants, I think I could say that. So no, but I need to introduce what I wanted to say because it may sound unkind. But I think what stood most out to me, Felicita, is, and by the way, thanks, hi all, and thank you for having me and all that, the pleasantry. But the most important thing for me that stood out is this report could have been written 20 years ago, and it would have been the same report. And 10 years ago, it would have been the same report. And today it's the same report. And that doesn't mean it's a bad report, it's a great report. And it deserves attention. I fully support Dora's comments in terms of the starting point of a conversation. But it's also painful, right? That's what's standing out for me. It's super painful to read that still, call it social enablers as the entry point for the discussion, or just, call it civil society, is, as you did in your little exercise, is under. I think the most important point, actually, Felicity, that we need to make is that civil society is part, not of the solution, that's what we've been saying for, but it's part of a health system. We shouldn't say, yeah, we offer human rights services, and yeah, we do, early alert systems, and yeah, we do monitoring, and yeah, we do, we're reaching the communities. It's not helpful to keep profiling and positioning little bits and pieces. We need to start speaking ourselves and also discipline ourselves, that we're thinkers too, and we're part of a UHC system. Without civil society will just not work. It will fail. We need to turn, our strength into a concisive argument that we're not putting forward at the moment as we could. And I think that's sort of also, therefore, something I was missing a little bit, because all the recommendations are great, right? But then higher level, there's something else we need to say. You keep not seeing us, and therefore you don't appreciate us. And then, that also translates then to us, that's a recommendation for donors, not just donors, by the way. You have all great donor recommendations, but it's also a recommendation for implemented countries, right? Equally, if not more important, that civil society is the partner. Finally, there's a flip side of this, of course, that we need to do a better job collectively, including North-South collaboration. I can speak at any time you want about the advocacy fund we're discussing. You're a member of that steering group, I think. But also, I hope that you bring this, and that's the starting point. You said it's a starting point for a conversation. I really hope that you bring this report to the tables where donors meet with civil society. We talk about the Global Fund, talk about UNAIDS, talk about WHO, talk about the African Union. I really hope that you follow through, because there's an important message to be made here, because it was 10 years ago important and 20 years ago important. I'm saying, so okay, let me stop here. Those are at least two things that stand out for me in terms of what's there, which is sort of painful, and also what the opportunities are in terms of, can we do a better job?
Yeah. Thanks, Peter, for sharing that. It's very sobering to hear it from you, with based on lots of wisdom and years and years and years of doing this work, decades of doing this work. And just to say that it resonated with me, because that was part of the findings of our COVID-19 mapping. The impact of COVID-19 on community systems was a clear finding that the community systems and the work that we do on social enablers and on human rights programming is not seen as part of a health system. It was not part of the essential services, and organizations struggled to get essential services permits to be able to continue doing their outreach. And these were even organizations that do service delivery. They really struggled to be recognized as part of an essential health service during the COVID response. So that really resonated with me when you said that the bottom line is that we need to still argue that we are part of a health system and we contribute to UHC outcomes. We contribute to the bigger health outcomes, and not that we are a separate engine working on human rights per se or social enablers that doesn't fit into the health system. That really resonated for me. Thank you so much for sharing that, Peter. Victor, what are your thoughts on the report and what stood out for you?
No, I just need to thank you for a good report, which is actually giving a true reflection of what is basically happening in our country as well. Dora mentioned about having these big NGOs, international goals, that are the beneficiaries of big chunks of HIV funding. In Malawi, the law says that I think they need to work with local partners. So they need to grant the funding, they are funding to the local organization, but this is not happening. It's very disappointing that we are the people who are doing the donkey work. We are all over in the places where we are in prisons, where they cannot even come to prison. They don't even have access, but still more they do enjoy a lot of funding from the donors. As she also mentioned about the co-funding, since we started as CREA, we have never received that money, that funding as co-funding. We are only, our funding is just activity-based funding. So it's actually very difficult for us to operate. And when you are talking of human rights work, as you put it, it's not just one thing. It could be that you have some clients with a different type of problem that is not part of that proposal. So you find it difficult. Sometimes you actually tell them that I think, no, we don't have funding for this. Can you just imagine? So as a human rights institution, it's like you are not actually helping people. You are not giving them confidence. So basically, I think what I wanted to say is that I think we are facing almost the similar things that Dola has said, and also Nana mentioned about a lot of things. But otherwise, this report actually it has unearthed all the things that I think they're actually hindering our work as human rights enablers in the country.
Oh, fantastic.
So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Victor. And I want to reflect so much on the things that everyone says, but I'm cognizant of time. We only have 8 minutes until what was supposed to be the closing of the session. I realize now that we were extremely ambitious in trying to do this in an hour and a half. But the promise is from our side that this is the beginning of a conversation. And we want to be part of a conversation and continuing a conversation with activists in our region and these types of organizations about what do we do now? How do we engage donors? How do we engage other stakeholders and allies around these issues? But I want to give you the option as panelists of responding to one of two questions. So I will ask two questions and you can then respond to whichever one of those resonates. And then also maybe say something in closing as we move towards, trying to conclude the webinar, because I'm also aware of the fact that many of you have other commitments and also the participants probably have commitments that they need to get to. So I'm trying not to go too much over time. So I will pose these two questions to you and you can choose which one you want to respond to and also kind of, include your overall key message for the webinar today. The one question is, what do you think it will take for us to reach the goal of 6% of all global AIDS resources for social enablers, including advocacy, community and political mobilization, community monitoring, outreach programs, and public communication by 2025 or 2030? What do you think it will take for us to reach that 6%, that goal of 6% of all investments, global AIDS investments for social enablers? The other question is, what opportunities exist for us to advocate for funding for social enablers? And you can speak to funding for social enablers at the national level, what is happening across the region, how can we mobilize more resources for regional work that supports social enablers, or international work. But feel free to respond to whatever part of the question resonates. So what will it take for us to reach the 6% for social enablers, and what opportunities exist to advocate for funding for social enablers? I will start with Dora, if you don't mind. Then I will go to Victor. Then I will go to Nana, and we'll end with Peter. Dora, are you ready? And please do remember to allow time for other speakers also, and for people to get to other commitments. Dora and I have the same problem. Go ahead.
I'll not speak in briefing. What I would call for us to get to the 6% is leadership. I would call out the leadership at all different levels. I would call out for the champions. Reflecting on the 2016 political declaration that our leaders, our presidents have signed on, we brought these fast track commitments back home. And for example, in my country, we led a presidential track initiative that said we would do these things. So I think what is critical at the level of political leadership, we need to call it out. We need to facilitate it. We need to mobilize it. And on our end, as civil society actors, I think what will ensure that we have this happen is we don't stop. We continue to lead. We have led all these years. I think leadership, championship, ensuring that we keep this conversation on the table is very key. And that is why still I celebrate this report as one of the tools that will ensure that we call out the leadership and we ourselves as the actors in the space, we continue to lead. One last part, the report has called for more working together, more integration, more consortiums, linking our voices at the regional level, but also at our local levels. I think leadership is going to be galvanized if indeed we speak together and continue to be on the table of conversations. When we challenge PEPFAR, let's not challenge PEPFAR as Uganda. Let's challenge PEPFAR as the region. Maybe our voice will be heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dora. Yeah, that was very insightful. We said that we would go to Victor, right?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Victor.
Yeah, I think I'll tackle the second question. What opportunities exist? I think the existence of the regional bodies, I think it can actually play a vital role. For example, we've been working with ARASA before. Of course, we can say that I think maybe the funding which they were giving us, they were not enough, but at least we are able to reach out to the people who wanted to reach to the targets. So if I think we can work as a block and then maybe develop a proposal as a block or else maybe if you can have a lead organization, so that I think we should actually go to a donor with one voice. That can work, because the report has actually indicated the capacity gaps which are there. Some can be good implementers, but when it comes to proposal writing, it will be a very difficult task on their part. They want to make it, but when it comes to actual implementation, there will be the stars. So I think if you can utilize that, that can work. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you for those insights, Victor. Nana?
Hey, so those are two very good questions. And I somehow, Phyllis, I feel that they are interconnected. Because on the one hand, you're saying, what does it take for us to reach the global target of 6% commitment to funding social enablers? And at the same time, you're saying, what are the opportunities? Because at the end of the day, if we take advantage of the opportunities that we have, we will ultimately meet the target of the 6%. And so I think it's really, really important that we introspect and we say, what does it take for us to convince the people who will, support raising these resources, that social enablers are equally important as anything else? And I think Peter talked to it, really making a value proposition for why this work is relevant and important and what value add it gives to mainstream programming. I mean, for example, in Botswana right now, there's a lot of initiatives, a lot of work happening to move us from 90 to 95. And it's that last 10% that's hard for people to reach. And it's hard because the people who are not accessing the services and getting the treatment and et cetera, are those that need us to actively have social enabler programs. And so it's really, really important for us to situate ourselves in the response such that we become the value proposition, so that then it's not a favor that's being done. We are part and parcel of what is the relevant response. So I really feel like we have to take opportunity of universal health coverage. What are we contributing when countries receive resources for social enablers in achieving universal health coverage? What are we contributing to the bigger SDG conversation? I think we really have to, and it would be good if ARASA could take up that initiative, bring together a core group of people who make a value proposition for social enabler funding, such that we're going with a common voice to the various governments to say, this is why we need this funding. And this is how ultimately it benefits you as a country. I think we basically need to situate ourselves there. Also, in terms of opportunities, I think, and I mentioned it earlier, the whole thing around social contracting, in terms of getting domestic funding to fund these programs. because the other issue on the report was heavily reliance on donor funding. Yes, we're relying on donor funding because, you know, historically, our governments haven't funded this kind of work because ultimately they see it as very sort of, you know, why would we give people money to criticize us or to, you know, hold us accountable in that way? But I think ultimately, if we can explain to them how it benefits and how it impacts the country as a whole in the national development agenda, they may start to change that. I would just like to say, sorry, I know I'm going on and I have you and Dora's problem. Today in Botswana, we launched the human rights, you know, the Botswana Human Rights Plan. It's a 5-year plan that has been owned by the government of Botswana, has been led, the process is led and worked in partnership with development partners and civil society. And ultimately, I think that's a great achievement because it means the country is committed to a human rights-based response to their programming for HIV and TB programs. It's been a lot of work to get here, but we're here. And now it's about, you know, us making sure that they deliver to their promise. And so it can happen, but it takes a lot of conscientious, consistent working advocacy. And so we need funding for that. You know, you need to be funded to do advocacy in order to get this achievement. So it's really, really important that donors continue to fund, that governments continue to fund, because ultimately it ends, we will get as a country or as people in various countries is the best health outcomes that we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nana. I mean, there's still so much to be discussed on these issues, and I feel terrible for limiting.
We'll have to have webinar part 2 in the February or January.
I know, we're just going to have a 5-day meeting to unpack this when things open up. Peter, please share your thoughts. Which of the questions?
I can actually, so those are great answers to your difficult questions. I think it's true that short term, you know, short term is linked to the long term, and there's something really short term, immediate that you could do, ARASA or this group or anybody. The Global Fund Board is meeting tomorrow for a retreat, discussing its future strategy, and it's a virtual retreat, right? But we know the people that are on the board, and we have easy access to the civil society delegations. I think it would be great, and I mean this, and I think it's important, having been there as a board member myself, that you, Felicita, you basically send an email to these, you know, civil society delegations, say, hey, we just discussed Human Rights Day, this important report, and we feel this is important background information for you, and or not even background information to bring to your discussions with other board members when you talk about the future of the Global Fund, the strategy of the future of the Global Fund. And I think, you know, we tend to forget the simple stuff, which is alerting people there's something important here, because the Global Fund Board loves, you know, to hear voices from the countries, from the regions, because that makes their work really valuable. And this report is a voice from a very important region for that fund. Very easy, one email. I can help you with all the addresses if you want.
Please do forward.
I will, sure, no problem.
Peter, do you want to talk a little bit, just 2 minutes, about this piece of work that we're doing together globally to try to catalyze a fund for national advocacy, and where those discussions are? And just to mention that I've been invited to present during the donor meeting with Ellen Maleche and Maria from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs next week, during an initial discussion with some of the donors. So I will be presenting these very findings to them next week.
Well, that's fantastic. So we is the Jubilant Institute, but it's hardly relevant. It's a couple of people from civil society basically did a lot of work for the 2018 conference. You know, lots of consultations, quite a few of you might have been there, looking at the 1990 targets and what it means for us, and that we're not reaching our goals, right? And at the end of that process, we focused on a couple of things, but one of the things was everybody said there's no funding for advocacy. So we wanted to explore this, and we looked for partners doing this with. So David Barr has been doing this. You may recognize the name. He's been reaching out to many civil society partners. I think there's now a group of over 150 people, NGOs that call themselves partner in this effort of establishing a fund for advocacy work at country level. And why do we do this? Because we hoped, right, that the Global Fund would do it. But the Global Fund's great, indeed, you mentioned it in your report, great in terms of funding human rights work, because there's a dedicated funding stream for that now. But actually, when you look at the Global Fund's success in supporting advocacy, it's not successful, not at all. Then we have the Robert Carr Fund, funding the global and regional networks. But who's funding advocacy at country level? Which is also at the heart of the point of transitioning countries, right? What have we seen in transitioning countries? Civil society work, prevention work, human rights work, all falls between the cracks, right? So there's a huge need, actually, I think, acknowledged by most left and right, I mean, donor and implementing countries, huge need for funding for that specific piece of work, country level advocacy work for maybe not just HIV, health in a broader sense. So there's been consultations, there have been consultations, the report is available, we can share it. There have been conversations with, we've been looking for leaders. Maya Esveld, you mentioned her name, is from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who's overseeing all these advocacy programs the Dutch government is funded. So she understands these issues. She's the co-chair on the donor, from the donor side, so to speak. Alan Malachi from Kenya, Nairobi, is the co-chair from the civil society point of view. And this is we're actively talking to donors now. Are you interested to discuss with us the reasons why and the opportunities for establishing call it a global fund for advocacy work at country level? and you're invited to one of the meetings of that's part of that process for Felicity to speak, which is great. I think that's super helpful. That's, we're trying to move this forward. The interesting and the good thing is that so far, all the donors that the small group has been talking to respond quite positively. People understand, somebody said it, donors are also nice people, Maria said it. They understand, but then you also need to come up with ideas of how to do it, building on experience that we have, etc., etc.
Yeah.
To be continued and hopefully to be launched, who knows.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. We have invited a lot of the ARASA partners and our allies in this region to join the mailing list for that group. I think it is extremely important work, and it is comforting to know that some of the work that we've done, particularly this research, can help provide some impetus for and messaging and evidence for the discussions we need to have with our donors, with our other allies, other stakeholders. And we are definitely more than committed to be part of that process. And we also hear the challenges that all of you as panelists have put out to organizations such as ARASA around some of the roles that we could play to help push this agenda forward, for this not to end with this report, but for us to help continue catalyzing and facilitating these dialogues. And to help push this advocacy. So we definitely hear the challenge that's been put to us, and we look forward to putting some of our energy in the next year and years going forward into this piece of work, because it is absolutely crucial to not only the survival of organizations that do this work, but also of our overall responses, our health responses broadly. So this is important work that we are keen to continue doing. With that, we've come to the end of our webinar this morning or this afternoon. I want to thank everyone who has come and joined us this morning. Also everyone who has stayed this long. I know that we've lost quite a few people as we've progressed. And as I said before, it's because it's Human Rights Day and people are being split in terms of the commitments that they need to attend to. I want to thank the Equal International, both Anton and Maria, for all their work. I mean, they really did a lot of work to get us to where we are today. But in particular, I want to thank you for your patience with us. As you know, Maria, by now, ARASA is not always the easiest client to work with, because as things evolve, we're always like, oh my gosh, we should do this too. We should do this too. We should include this too. So sometimes it takes a lot of patience to work with organizations like us on pieces of work like us that are constantly evolving. But it was also, sobering to actually get to a point where it's like, actually now we need to stop and actually launch this report. So thank you for, pushing us to get to this point. I want to thank all the panelists for joining us. Some of you, all of you, received the invite to join the panel at very short notice. I want to thank you so much for always answering our calls, responding to our emails, and indulging us even when we challenge you, and request things from you at the last minute. We really do appreciate your support and your solidarity that we share. I want to thank also the ARASA staff, but before I thank them, I want to thank all the respondents, all the donors, civil society respondents, everyone who participated in the survey, but also in the key informant interviews. Without them and their time, this really would not have been possible. Also thanking the Robert Carr Fund for their support for this piece of work, but also their commitment to supporting regional organizations, regional networks and partnerships, and international partnerships and organizations such as ARASA. Without your support, a lot of this would not have been possible. We really do appreciate it. And then lastly, just a big thank you to the ARASA team, and well done team for getting to this point where we can actually say, well done, it's our last webinar for the year. So thank you so much, team, and for all the work that you did behind the scenes. I really do appreciate you, and I appreciate all your hard work. And with that, I want to wish you a good day further. Peter, I will be in touch about those email addresses. We will send that email off right away before close of business today. And then I'll be in touch with many of you about the specifics. We'll share the presentation and a link to the reports and the brief. And then we hope to take this conversation further with you. Have a good day further. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for joining. All right. Bye.